Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-priced commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Forgotten Realms' most prolific author, Volo Guide to Monsters. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like the content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commanders you can vote for in the comments for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Volo Guide to Monsters is a 3/2 human wizard that costs 2, a green and a blue, with the following effect. Whenever you cast a creature spell that doesn't share a creature type with any creature you control or a creature in your graveyard, copy that spell. Sporting a mid-size CMC and below average stat line for the cost, Volo more than makes up for this with a unique and impressive ability that allows us to summon 2 creatures for the price of 1, so long as we don't overlap on their typing. Evaluating it on its surface, it's simply a superb value piece, getting us double the amount of bodies every time we cast a creature, doubling up on their ETB triggers, death triggers, and attack triggers, and all for no extra mana investment. The tricky part is adhering to Volo's restriction, as once deck building starts, the type restriction becomes much more evident. Common creature types like Beast, Elemental, Elf, and Druid all have superb specimens with powerful effects that would be great to double up on, but if we run more than a single copy, we run the risk of shutting down our commander's ability. Diving a bit deeper into Volo's ability, there are a few interactions that are worth considering when building him. Mutate, for example, is a superb way to take advantage of Volo's creature doubling, as when creatures are cast for their mutate cost, they still get copied, with the caveat that they still need to mutate onto the initial target. While this may seem counterintuitive at first, when combined with mutate creatures that care about every time the creature mutates, we effectively get 3 mutate triggers for the price of 1. 1 time for the initial mutate, and 2 more for the second mutate for some truly absurd value. Morph is another ability that interacts strangely with Volo, as when we cast a morphed creature, since it has no type, we do get 2. However, the token copy is just a vanilla 2/2 with no CMC and is unable to turn itself face up. Finally, evoke creatures are worth mentioning as well, as when they're cast for their evoke cost, both the original creature and the created token are considered to have been evoked, so we still need to sack both of them once their ETB effects resolve. So now that we know a bit more about Volo and some of the more common interactions with him, the question turns to what would be the most effective way to build him. While some builds that rely heavily on clone effects and mutates are certainly viable, since those creatures change their type or tuck themselves under their targets to conceal their type, I personally found these builds to be a bit unreliable at times. Considering that most clone effects are shape changers and most mutates are beasts, once one of them hits the bin, Volo will be shut off for a portion of our deck unless we can find a way to remove it. So in the end, I decided to go all in on Volo's gimmick, creating an anti-tribal build focused on having as many creatures as possible from different tribes with no overlap. That means we'll be running a variety of specimens with potent enter the battlefield abilities that Volo can double up on, static abilities that threaten to take over the game if not dealt with, recurring value creatures that we can double up on turn after turn, and finally just huge creatures we can smash face with. Additionally, we'll also be putting special emphasis on keeping Volo alive in this build, as any opponent with even basic knowledge of threat assessment will correctly realize that Volo is a kill-on-sight commander, his creature doubling ability being so potent that even triggering it once or twice with the correct creature is enough for him to take over the game. That means we'll need to protect him against all the targeted removal and board wipes that will be likely thrown his way, which is why we'll be running plenty of ways to grant him hexproof, regenerate him, and counter effects that we'd rather not deal with, all in an effort to keep him alive as long as possible to continue flooding the board with extra bodies. So let's put on our pith helmets, get in the jeep, and have Volo lead our opponents on a safari across the plane for them to encounter its most fascinating specimens. Just be sure to remind them that we're not responsible for any injuries they may sustain in the process. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have a single entry with Neverwinter Dryad, a 1/1 that we can pay 2 and sack to put a basic forest from our deck into play tapped, making it a decent source of land ramp early and even better later if we're able to double up on it. More ramp joins us in the CMC 2 slot with Maraleaf Pixie, Elysian Caryatid, and Kiora's Follower. Maraleaf Pixie is a 2/2 flyer that can be tapped for either of our colors, making it a good mana dork with a decent evasive body for the cost. Elysian Caryatid is a 1/1 that can be tapped for any color, or for 2 of the same color instead if we control a creature with 4 or more power, giving us some serviceable ramp early and becomes even better once our bigger creatures hit the board. Kiora's Follower is a 2/2 that we can tap to untap another target permanent, allowing us to untap our lands for additional ramp or creatures to serve as blockers or to reactivate their abilities, both of which are beneficial for us. Finally, closing out this slot, we have Sakura Tribelder, a 1/1 that we can sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, providing us some staple green land ramp that becomes even better when doubled up by our commander. Moving on to the CMC3 slot, we'll start off with some utility in the form of Loyal Drake, Mana War, and Plaxcaster Frogling. Loyal Drake is a 2/2 flyer that, at the beginning of our combat step, draws us a card if we control our commander, serving as a great source of continual card draw as this build focuses on keeping our commander alive for as long as possible. Mana War is a 2/2 that, when it ETBs, bounces a creature back to its owner's hand, serving as some disruption for our opponent's creatures or a means to get our own creatures back to hand to get even more copies of them later. Plaxcaster Frogling is a 0/0 with Graft 3 that we can pay 2 to grant a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it Shroud until the end of the turn, giving us a decent way to protect our commander if played first by having it grant one of its counters to him thanks to Graft, and shielding him from targeted removal for little cost. A pair of threats that grow out of control quickly are up next with Scoot Swarm and Managorger Hydra. Scoot Swarm is a 1/1 that, when a land comes into play, creates a 1/1 insect, or, if we have 6 or more lands in play, creates a copy of itself, quickly flooding the board with exponentially growing numbers of itself once we hit 6 lands, and becoming even more terrifying if we manage to mutate onto it. Managorger Hydra is a 1/1 with Trample that gains a +1/+1 counter anytime any player casts a spell, growing bigger and bigger every turn and benefiting from the protection effects meant for our commander if we wish to keep it alive instead. Reaching the end of this slot, we come to a pair of mutate creatures with Sea Dasher Octopus and Glowstone Recluse. Sea Dasher Octopus is a 2/2 with Flash that can mutate for 1 and a blue that draws us a card whenever it deals combat damage to a player, making it a prime target to double up with Volo to Flash mutate onto a creature to draw us 2 cards every time that creature connects. Glowstone Recluse is a 2/3 with Reach, mutate for 3 and a green, and has, whenever this creature mutates, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, allowing it to grant 6 +1/+1 counters to its mutate target alongside our commander for a respectable permanent stat increase at the cost of only 4 mana. The CMC4 slot is up next, starting with some ETB effects with Solemn Simulacrum, Thought Sponge, and Vizier of Many Faces. Solemn Simulacrum is a 2/2 that, when it ETBs, puts a basic land from our deck into play tapped, and, when it dies, draws us a card, making it a superb value piece with its rampant card advantage on a body that we should aim to double up on whenever possible. Thought Sponge is a 1/1 with Flash that, when it ETBs, comes into play with +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of cards an opponent drew that turn, and, when it dies, draws us cards equal to its power, giving us a means to piggyback on our opponent's draws with a big creature now and card advantage later. Vizier of Many Faces is a 0/0 that comes into play as a copy of any creature and has Embalm for 3 and double blue, allowing it to become 1 or 2 copies of the biggest threat on the battlefield in addition to being castable again from the bin later. Some utility options join us as we move deeper into this slot with Beast Whisperer, Temur Sabertooth, and Wonder. Beast Whisperer is a 2/3 that draws us a card whenever we cast a creature spell, taking advantage of our large creature base to grant us a steady stream of card advantage throughout the course of the game. Temur Sabertooth is a 4/3 that lets us pay 1 and a green to bounce a creature we control back to hand and make itself indestructible, making it a hard-to-remove threat that can protect our commander and our other non-tokens from removal by bouncing them back to hand to be cast again later. Wonder is a 2/2 flyer that, so long as it's in our graveyard and we control an island, grants all our creatures flying, providing all our creatures with a hard-to-remove source of evasion once it hits the bin and serving as an okay evasive body in the meantime. Passing the halfway mark, we get to some prime targets to double up on with Reefworm, Amphin Mutineer, and Shifting Ceratops. Reefworm is a 0/1 that, when it dies, creates a 3/3, who, when it dies, creates a 6/6, who, when it dies, creates a 9/9, making it a reverse nesting doll that just keeps getting bigger and bigger as it gets removed, making it a potent blocker and screen against board wipes. Amphin Mutineer is a 4/3 that, when it ETBs, exiles a non-salamander creature and gives its controller a 4/3 to replace it, as well as having Encore for 4 and double blue, giving us some decent single target removal initially, which we can later play from the bin to exile up to 3 more targets. Shifting Ceratops is a 5/4 with protection from blue that can't be countered, and we can pay a green to give either Reach, Trample, or Haste until end of turn, providing us with a beefy body, relevant protection against control decks, and access to some decent keywords for a relatively low cost. Finally, reaching the end of this slot, we have a pair of growing threats with Lumberknot and Algae Gharial, both being 1/1s that get a +1/+1 counter whenever another creature dies, the former having hexproof and the latter having shroud, making them threats that just keep getting bigger over time as creatures are removed and are difficult for our opponents to deal with outside of wiping the board. Reaching the CMC 5 slot, we'll start off with some ETB effects with Acidic Slime, Mulldrifter, and Voracious Greatshark. Acidic Slime is a 2/2 with Death Touch that, when it ETBs, destroys an artifact, enchantment, or land, giving us a decent defensive body capable of dealing with a variety of back row threats. Mulldrifter is a 2/2 flyer that draws us 2 cards when it ETBs and can be evoked for 2 and a blue, which we can play early for just the draw, or later for the evasive body as well. Voracious Greatshark is a 5/4 with Flash that, when it ETBs, counters target creature or artifact spell, making it a potent disruption tool that leaves a decently sized body on the board afterwards. A pair of mutate creatures then joins us next with Auspicious Sterix and Souvenir Snatcher. Auspicious Sterix is a 6/6 with mutate for 5 and a green that, whenever it mutates, exiles cards from the top of our library until we reveal X permanents, X being equal to the amount of times the creature mutated, and puts those permanents into play, putting a whopping 5 permanents into play for free alongside our commander for a potentially huge tempo swing. Souvenir Snatcher is a 4/4 flyer with mutate for 4 and double blue that, whenever it mutates, allows us to take control of target artifact, again working nicely with our commander to steal up to 3 artifacts from our opponents with a single card, and even granting evasion to its mutate target as a bonus. Finally, we close out this slot with Loyal Guardian and Bladegrift Prototype. Loyal Guardian is a 4/4 with Trample that, at the beginning of our combat phase, if we control our commander, puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, growing itself and our other creatures turn after turn, which benefits our creature-heavy playstyle. Bladegrift Prototype is a 3/2 flyer that, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, destroys a non-land permanent that one of our opponents controls of that player's choice, making it a repeatable source of removal that, while our opponents may control, can never really be turned against us. The CMC 6 slot is up next, starting off with some flying threats in the form of Aethertide Whale, Sharding Sphinx, and Steel Hellkite. Aethertide Whale is a 6/4 flyer that generates 6 energy when it ETBs and lets us pay 4 energy to return it to our hand, giving us a big evasive body that can protect itself from wipes and removal by bouncing itself back to hand to be played again on a later turn. Sharding Sphinx is a 4/4 artifact flyer that, when any artifact creature we control deals combat damage to a player, it creates a 1/1 artifact creature with flying, making it a creature we definitely want to double up on with our commander to exponentially flood the board with tokens turn after turn as both it and the tokens it creates swing in. Steel Hellkite is a 5/5 flyer that we can pay 2 to give +1/+0 until end of turn, and we can pay X to destroy each non-land permanent with CMC value of X that belongs to a player that was dealt damage by it, usable only once per turn, providing us with yet another big evasive body that serves as repeatable AoE removal. Finally, we end this lot with Primordial Sage, a 4/5 that draws us a card whenever we cast a creature spell, giving us yet another source of card advantage that synergizes well with our large creature base. Next up is the CMC 7 slot and its trio of members with Beanstalk Giant, Diluvian Primordial, and Simic Sky Swallower. Beanstalk Giant is a star whose power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we control and has Adventure for 3 and a green to put a basic land from our deck into play, making it a decent source of ramp early and a huge creature later for some decent flexibility. Diluvian Primordial is a 5/5 flyer that, when it ETBs, allows us to cast an instant or sorcery from each of our opponent's graveyards without paying its mana cost, exiling them when we do so, giving us up to 3 or even 6 free spells alongside our commander that leaves behind a big evasive body once the dust is settled. Simic Sky Swallower is a 6/6 flyer with Trample and Shroud, serving as a huge evasive and difficult to deal with threat whose sole function is to swing into our opponents, preferably with a clone of itself if possible, to make short work of their life totals. Moving into the CMC 8 slot, we have its single entrant with Terastodon, a 9/9 that, when it ETBs, lets us destroy up to 3 non-creature permanents and give their controllers 3/3s to replace them, giving us a massive stat line that can devastate all types of back row threats and we love to double up on for double the devastation. Finally, reaching the CMC 9 slot and our final creature, we have Artisan of Kozilek, a 10/9 with Annihilator 2 that, when we cast it, returns a creature from our grave back into play, giving us a huge stat block, Annihilator 2, to force anyone we attack to sack 2 permanents every time it swings, and even reanimates one of our creatures, making it a near-perfect beat stick to copy, but keep in mind that the copy does not reanimate a creature since that one's not cast. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. The CMC 1 slot begins only with a single entry, that being Rapid Hybridization, which destroys a creature, prevents it from regenerating, and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it, giving us some very low cost removal with relatively low downside. A trio of counterspells then joins us in the CMC 2 slot with Counterspell, Negate, and Arcane Denial, The first countering anything, the second only countering non-creature spells, and the third countering anything but letting the spell's caster draw 2 while we draw 1 on the next turn's upkeep, all serving as cheap disruption to prevent our boards from being cleared and our commander from being dealt with. Closing out this slot, we have Growth Spiral and Rapid Vigor. Growth Spiral lets us draw a card, then put an extra land into play, giving us some serviceable ramp and replacing itself as it does so as a bonus. Rapid Vigor regenerates all our creatures, making it a potent source of board wipe protection to keep our commander, creatures, and tokens alive through most standard wipes. Moving to the CMC3 slot, we only have a single entry with Beast Within, which destroys a permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it, giving us some staple green removal that deals with almost any type of threat with relatively little downside. Finally, skipping to the CMC5 slot, we come to our last instant with Perplexing Test, which has us either return all creature tokens or all non-token creatures to their owner's hands, making it a powerful selective wipe to keep our tokens on board while bouncing everything back at instant speed, only to be played and copied again as our tokens are dealt with. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, we have a pair of ramp spells with Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which put a land into play tapped from our deck, the former being limited to basics and the latter to any non-forest that has a basic land type, giving us some staple green land ramp to help us get to our commander and our bigger creatures that much quicker. The CMC3 slot then gives us even more ramp with Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Nissa's Pilgrimage, all three searching our deck for 2 lands, putting one into play tapped and the other one into our hand. The first 2 being limited to basics, and the third only for basic forests, but searching for 3 instead of 2 if we have 2 or more instants or sorceries in our grave when we cast it, all 3 providing us with even further ramp to help smooth out our land drops throughout the course of the game. Skipping to the CMC5 slot, we have some card draw with Shamanic Revelation, which draws us a card for every creature we have in play and gains us 4 life for every creature among those that has 4 or more power, making it a great source of card advantage thanks to our large creature base and token creation, with some life gain upside thanks to our larger creatures. Skipping again to the CMC8 slot, we get to our last sorcery with Azuri's Predation, which creates a 4/4 for every creature our opponents control, then has each of them fight each one of those creatures, giving us a large amount of tokens that can easily clear the board of most if not all of our opponent's creatures while leaving us a sizable board state after the dust clears. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Skipping to the CMC3 slot, we have our only 3 enchantments with Elemental Bond, Molting Skin, and Broken Fall. Elemental Bond draws us a card every time a creature we control with power 3 or greater ETBs, triggering both as we summon our creatures and create tokens alongside our commander for a superb amount of card advantage. Molting Skin and Broken Fall both allow us to return them to our hand to regenerate target creature, making them great ways to repeatedly protect our commander or other creatures from most targeted removal and board wipes. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. The CMC1 slot starts us off with Giant's Amulet, an equipment that equips for 2, gives the enchanted creature +0/+1, as well as hexproof so long as it remains untapped. Additionally, it allows us to pay 3 and a blue when it ETBs to create a 4/4 and equip this to it, which will usually just be casting for its normal cost as a cheap source of hexproof to protect our commander from removal. More sources of hexproof join us in the CMC2 slot with Mask of Avacyn and Swiftfoot Boots. Mask of Avacyn is an equipment that equips for 3 and grants the equipped creature +1/+2 and hexproof, again giving our commander more targeted removal protection as well as a decent stat increase. Swiftfoot Boots is an equipment that equips for 1 and grants the equipped creature hexproof and haste, making it a cheap source of hexproof for our commander or a haste enabler for one of our attack-focused creatures if needed. Then we come to our last 2 artifacts with Lifecrafter's Bestiary and Twinning Staff. Lifecrafter's Bestiary scries 1 on our upkeep and lets us pay a green whenever we cast a creature spell to draw a card, giving us yet another card advantage source that synergizes with our large creature base. Twinning Staff copies a spell an additional time when it would be copied and lets us pay 7 and tap it to copy an instant or sorcery we control, its passive allowing Volo to create 2 copies instead of 1 for some insane value, and its activated ability letting us double up on instants and sorceries in the late game if we need to. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Our only Planeswalker joins us in the CMC3 slot, that being Vivian, Champion of the Wilds, who comes into play with 4 loyalty, has a static ability that lets us cast our creature spells as though they had flash, and has the following abilities. Her +1 grants a creature vigilance and reach until our next turn, and her -2 lets us look at the top 3 cards of our deck, exiling 1 and putting the rest at the bottom of our library, allowing us to cast the exiled card if it's a creature, providing us with a huge amount of flexibility by letting us cast our creatures at instant speed, in addition to some serviceable keyword distribution and card advantage to boot. That covers our Planeswalker, so let's move on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Yavimaya Coast, which taps for a colorless or either of our colors if we take a damage, Vine Glimmer Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a forest or island and taps for either of our colors, Rimewood Falls, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and counts as a forest and an island, Temple of Mystery, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs, Quandrix Campus, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors, and we can pay 4 and tap it to scry 1. Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped. And finally, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. For utility lands, we'll be running Alchemist's Refuge, Ghost Quarter, and Scavenger Grounds. Alchemist's Refuge taps for a colorless, and we can pay a green, a blue, and tap it to be able to cast non-land cards at instant speed until the end of the turn, enabling us to cast all our spells at instant speed repeatedly at a low cost, all on a land slot which is difficult for our opponents to interact with. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless, and we can tap it and sack it to destroy a land, giving its controller a basic from their deck to replace it, making it a good source of spot removal for our opponent's utility lands. Scavenger Grounds taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to exile all cards from all graveyards, making it a piece of potent AoE graveyard hate to combat against graveyard-focused playstyles. Lastly, we're running 11 islands and 13 forests as our basics to fill out our land slots. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 40 creatures including the commander, 8 instants, 7 sorceries, 3 enchantments, 5 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 40 unique creature types in the deck with no overlap, 9 creatures with ETB triggers, 9 creatures with static effects, 9 creatures with activated abilities, 5 creatures with attack and damage triggers, 4 creatures that can mutate, and 8 cards that protect our commander from removal, giving us a menagerie of creatures that can trigger our commander's token creation, most of which have effects and abilities that benefit from having multiple copies, alongside a number of ways to protect our commander from removal as our opponents attempt to get rid of him. For general deck stats, we have 14 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 14 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes. Our ramp and targeted removal being a bit higher than usual due to it being tied to some of our creatures, but is still very beneficial to us to get to our commander and bigger creatures quicker and keep the board free of threats, while our card draw and board wipes remain at fairly standard numbers. Looking at our mana curve, we have 3 1-drops, 13 2-drops, 17 3-drops, 12 4-drops, 9 5-drops, 4 6-drops, 3 7-drops, 2 8-drops, and 1 9-drop, giving us a mid to late game curve that allows us to ramp hard and set up protection for our commander in the early game in order to take maximum advantage of his token creation and protect him in the mid to late game. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.34, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For some side grades, we can consider swapping in creatures of the same type. Runic Armosaur, for example, makes a great dinosaur to provide us with card advantage as our opponents activate abilities. Kaiga the Tidestar is a good dragon spirit to sub in, giving us a decent evasive body and allowing us to immediately steal an opponent's creature when the token dies due to the legendary rule. Rampaging Bealoths makes a superb beast to double up on and flood the board with bodies as we make our land drops return. And finally, Phyrexian Metamorph is a great shape changer that can copy an artifact as well as a creature if needed. New creature types can be added in as well, such as Murkfiend Liege, a horror that can pump all our colored creatures, including its copy, and allowing us to untap all our colored creatures every turn. Scourge of the Fleet is a Kraken that provides a decent one-sided board wipe when it ETBs alongside a big body, and Perplexing Chimera can serve as a potent disruption tool for our opponents who have to constantly be aware of it lest we steal their game-winning spell from under their noses. For some upgrades, Heroic Intervention is a great way to further protect our board from wipes on the cheap. Seedborn Muse is a powerful spirit that untaps our board on each of our opponent's turns to put up blockers and free up mana for other use. Spark Double is a great clone effect that can even double up on Volo or other commanders as it ignores a legend rule. Avenger of Zendikar makes a potent top-end finisher to flood the board with tokens to take advantage of all our land ramp. Tindershoot Dryad is another source of tokens whose ascend comes online quickly due to R and its own token creation. Wormcoil Engine is another great creature to clone for its stat line, keywords, and death trigger. Consecrated Sphinx is possibly the best card draw we can add to the deck and is positively insane when doubled up. And Craterhoof Behemoth makes for a near-perfect finisher to boost our large board into the stratosphere with its AoE trample and stat boost, and of course is even more backbreaking when doubled up. Finally, Gilded Drake makes for a powerful theft ability for only 2 mana, allowing us to exchange control of it for any of our opponent's creatures. Just be sure to get it back after the game unless you want to be out its $400 price tag. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. We're in the home stretch now, having blown past 900 subs and cracking the 950 sub mark with less than 40 subs to get to 1K. I'd like to thank everyone again for all your support, your views, and your subs, as this channel's growth would not be possible without it. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, after a close race it looks like Nylor has managed to mind control his way to the top spot, and will be the subject of next week's build. Moving on to next week's poll, we'll be shaking the polls up again and putting the spotlight on some legendary heroes of the Forgotten Realms, with the new lineup featuring Catabree of Mithril Hall, Wulfgar of Icewind Dale, and Minsk Beloved Ranger. Let me know in the comments which of these legendary heroes you would like to see an upcoming episode on. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.